the last presentation today is our own Professor Kwai-Cheung Lo. His paper is China's Cloud Control in the Shadows of Ecological Civilization. We all know Casey very well, but I will go through his introduction anyway. Professor Lo is professor and head of the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing at Hong Kong Baptist University. He is the author of Excess and Masculinity. What a wonderful title. Excess and Masculinity in Asian Cultural Productions. And another book, Chinese Face Off, another excellent title. Chinese Face Off, the Transnational Popular Culture of Hong Kong, and co-editor of Chinese Shock of the Anthropocene, Image, Music, and the Text in the Age of Climate Change. And Casey, handing over to you.
Thanks for Jessica. Let me share my screen. I hope everybody can see it, right? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Thanks, Juan. Okay, let me start with, oops. William Burroughs, in his famous essay, The Limits of Control, points out that there is always an implicit impasse in all control systems. Control mechanism needs opposition that it cannot completely control. When there's no more opposition, and when control is complete, the fulfillment would render the system meaningless. That may explain why today's control mechanism can do without an object, as control becomes an object in and of itself, i.e., control becomes its own object, nor control is contained by any specific object. Ultimately, it is separated from any concrete object and stands alone without an object beyond itself. And digital control does not rely on the process of subjectivation, and neither does it aim at producing an obedient subject. In other words, the culture of control no longer aims at disciplining that may free itself from any limits. However, there is nothing more unlimited, incomplete, or unfulfilling than weather control, which is called geoengineering, a technology that helps humans to modify and manipulate the weather. For decades, China has been investing heavily in this technology, resulting with owning one of the world's most advanced weather modification programs, even though the definitive scientific evidence for the efficacy of cloud seeding, rainmaking, rain suppression, or hail suppressions remains undetermined. In response to the consistent drought, severe storms, and for the strategic needs to modify the weather for preventing natural disaster and serving political aims, the State Council has announced in late 2020 to launch an extensive scheme to expand its rainmaking capabilities to cover 60% of the country's territories by 2025. That is about 5.5 million square kilometers, a size larger than India. And for hail suppression, it should go beyond 580,000 square kilometers. The target year undoubtedly resonates with the goals of Made in China 2025 to realize Beijing's quest for global technological leadership. Changing and controlling the environment, including the weather, is part of human nature for millennia. By no means is China alone that has strong desire to control the natural environment, even though the PRC is the first state that initiates and implements an extensive nationwide government monitor project of civilizing the ecology, the so-called ecological civilization. In comparison to landscape altering projects like the Three Gorges Dam, South-North Water Transfer Project, or building numerous sponge cities, weather modification in China seems only a modest and inexpensive program with limited social consequences. Indeed, the Chinese goal of the weather modification has for long been restrained. They're only aiming at getting more precipitation in dry areas, reducing hail destructive to farming field, and ensuring blue sky in significant national events are only moderate kind of schemes. However, as the geopolitical tensions are growing in the region, Beijing's ambition to weather the weather, even only within its territorial sovereignty, inevitably arouses the suspicions from its neighboring countries. For example, India, that recently has bloody border dispute with China, expresses deep concerns if the Chinese weather modifications may negatively affect the monsoon rains its agriculture depends on, and also worries such technologies could give China the edge in any future conflicts in the Himalaya mountains by weaponizing weather for troop movements. The hydroengineering project of diverting water vapor in the Tibet Plateau northwards to ease shortage in China's drive north may eventually pose unpredictable threats to Southeast Asia, since the Tibetan Plateau is the largest freshwater reserve in the entire region, the so-called Third Pole, and the source of many rivers flowing through Indochina. The absence of proper international coordination of weather modification activity, even if confined to be domestic, could lead to the charges of rain stealing between neighboring regions. Weaponizing weather for military purposes, in fact, began with the US government during the Cold War period. The American military has heavily supported the development of weather sciences for meteorological research after World War II. To counteract the Soviets' successful launch of the satellite Sputnik, the US in late 1950s started to explore the possibilities for weaponized weather and climate control, including the manipulation of color pigments, carbon dioxide, and artificial satellites. In the Vietnam War, the White House was actively involved in directing the secret mission in cloud seeding over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in order to flood the communist supply routes. Whether weather can be effectively weaponized to serve military purposes remain doubtful. But climate geoengineering, which is mainly defined as the technology of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, is getting its momentum in the 21st century. Those who advocate solar geoengineering argue that it is technologically easy to stop global warming by injecting reflective particles of sulfuric acid into the upper atmosphere, where they could scatter a fraction of incoming sunlight back to the space, creating a sunshade for the earth beneath. However, there are a lot of uncertainties about the potential side effects and the practical deployment of such specialized aircrafts and dispersal methods. China's geoengineering endeavors do not only reveal the authorities' plan to control the crowds in order to regulate the weather, but also their desire to take the form of the crowds by assuming a privileged, transcendent vantage point up in the sky above the earth. No one will be surprised by such a fantasy of political elites who want to play God by seeing the world in its entirety, understanding the will and explaining all. The specific Chinese context serves as a good example to understand the control paradox. The state-led ecological civilization project is meant to monopolize and control the discourse and discussions of China's environmental issues, while unintentionally generating new kinds of ecological imaginary from its highly repressed and censored civil society. Even though ecological civilization endeavors to maintain the impossible balance and reconcile tensions between unending economic growth and environmental protection, the burdens economic development imposes on ecology may overturn the official discursive descriptions of so-called harmony and heighten the social expectations for transformation. The Chinese state project of ecological civilization appeared as a top-down model built upon the socialist ideologies with the emphasis on the mutual compatibility of economic growth, environmental sustainability, social justice, and quality of life. The idea has been introduced to Chinese society through local government and NGO projects, as well as academic discussions. I guess what Zimu has mentioned earlier were kind of inspired by the Soviet kind of magazine, and then Victor also mentioned, tried to trace the traditional origins of ecological civilization. So it seems like they are kind of inspired by multiple sources. So in 1918, well, the CCP wrote the goal of building an ecological civilization in the Constitution as the guiding principle for its development. Being aware of the huge environmental costs paid by the economic development and intends to seek a model different from the Euro-American modernization, Chinese top leaders consciously and unconsciously have shown their interest in and acceptance of constructive postmodern philosophy and its way of thinking to enable their turn toward an ecological civilization. In the Chinese understanding, constructive postmodernism, which is very different from French postmodern, is a philosophy derived from Alfred North Whitehead and developed by some American theology scholars like John Cobb Jr. and David Ray Griffin that emphasize a pluralistic but integrative worldview to solve various pressing issues facing China and to guide the country to achieve modernization goals in harmonious and ecological ways. According to John Cobb Jr., the Chinese government has accepted their suggestions to shift its rural policy by encouraging migration from cities to countryside, because ecological civilization requires ecological agriculture in ecological villages. But the state-led ecological civilization campaigns remains predominantly a top-down, non-transparent, and non-participatory project that single-mindedly pursues the stipulated objectives and may possibly create second-order problems and unintended consequences. Because relatively little consultation has been done with local communities, and the existing hierarchies reproduce urban-rural disparities, as well as reinforce inequalities between central state powers and marginalized ethnic minorities. As the regime's legitimacy primarily depends on its economic performance, ruling elites who are not directly held accountable to the society could still be constrained in its ecological governance when its sustainability objectives have to succumb to political mission of continuously creating wealth. So the contradictory priorities and different goals are usually in conflict. The image of clouds is also manifest in China's determination to monitor the cloud computing industry. For competitive and governance reasons, Beijing is eager to foster the capabilities of Chinese cloud company, not only the big firms like Alibaba, Huawei, and Tencent, but also some unknown newcomers. Well, the names, well, we never heard of, like these were Baoxing, Maxen, Sand4, Sukcom, or Yowadata. President Xi has strong confidence that China will become the center of technological innovation over the next decade. New investment and migration have been reoriented from wealthy coastal cities to poor interior landlocked provinces, whereas the state is heavily nourishing and subsidizing thousands of new tech companies focusing on AI, cloud computing, and robotics. Cracking down on the tech giants recently in order to assert the supremacy of the CCP and to redistribute wealth for his common prosperity campaign, President Xi also aims at producing China's homegrown hard technologies for achieving self-sufficiency from the unfriendly Western world. It is too early to judge if such grand strategy will succeed in enhancing the nation's productivity, but it is evident that China shows strong signs of inward looking and of leaving behind a successful collaborative model with foreign companies that bring in capital and high-tech gears over the last 3 decades. The inward orientation of high-tech development may reflect how the nation-state envisions an alternative to the post-war Western liberal global order. and to carve up the world into different spheres of influence within which each country knows its place under such balance of power. It seems to be the dream of an authoritarian state to become an isolated crowd over its sphere of influence, to put it metaphorically. An isolated crowd is named cumulus. Cumulus crowds are detached individual cauliflower-shaped clouds, often described as puffy or cotton-like, and usually they are spotted in fair weather conditions. But cumulus clouds won't remain detached for long. They can later develop into towering clouds accompanying with powerful thunderstorms. The association of crowds with freedom, mobility, unrestricted circulation, and interconnection also covers the operations of crowd computing. Crowd computing is a kind of computation that conceals the distinction between software and hardware by naturalizing the computer as integral part of the environment. While cloud computing promises the dematerialization of data storage and the ubiquitous connectivity of frictionless computation in all spaces, its nature and infrastructure cannot be obscured as shapeless, amorphous clouds, but remains as grid network constructions and data hubs at some real locations that require immense amounts of power to keep them running and are simultaneously emitting carbon dioxide. It is actually a straight-tip space that pretends to be a smooth space in Deleuze's terminology. An efficient crowd system enables China's surveillance mechanism and digital security function seamlessly and creates an all-round power control. However, such control also runs into another paradox. In order to monitor and screen the information flows in the nation's digital networks, all messages sent on China's platform, for example, on WeChat, the most widely used messaging applications, are required to pass through central servers unencrypted so that authorities can filter and censor them. The mandates makes those servers weak in security and vulnerable to any foreign intelligence agency that wants to spy on Chinese citizens. As the Chinese surveillance system is an entrenched mechanism built on censoring and monitoring its own people, the contradiction between security against enemies within and those without will not be overcome. The more the operation of the authoritarian state relies on the security weakness in the civil society, the harder the existing loophole can be fixed or removed. The crowd image eliminates the representation, but not the existence of the grid structure of computation. It may be true that the ruling elites do want to associate with the cloud image in order to emphasize their celestial power and privilege. But at the same time, they also like to foreground the grid they have built on the ground, so as to glorify the magnificent infrastructure that has united the big nation, and we configure the world as a network of connectivity in which China becomes the central hub. The grid, of course, refers to China's 3 decades infrastructure investment and urbanization boom and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. But these mega construction projects have also created their own serious problems, like the environmental risks that undermine the ecological civilization campaign. Many of these infrastructure investments are neither productive or well managed, becoming a threat to the economies of China and other nations participating in the BRI. Without any doubt, China is not the only country in the world that manipulates the crowds in terms of modifying weather and doing digital surveillance. But China serves as a good model, not only given its sheer size, growth rate, and volatile situation, to examine how the combination of geoengineering and digital technologies impacts on crowd control. cloud could mean both connection and isolation. As if China wants global trade and economic self-sufficiency at the same time. President Xi has vigorously promoted the mechanism of double circulation, while it may have risks to become inner loop, the so-called 内循环, or even involution, 内卷, both from the perspective of control. Involution does not mean failure, because involution is a situation where new input has been brought in, but there are no real changes in social structure, and the same pattern or cycle continues. Etymologically, control means stopping the roll or the wheel. Hence, stagnation may imply the success of control. As long as there is no way to stop cloud rolling, control can never succeed, but is self-motivated to perpetuate. So I will stop here. Thanks for